It's time to make the Christmas ornament. I've been making a lot of spheres lately, and I thought maybe it was time to make a proper spherical Christmas ornament. I went through a bunch of different ideas for things and couldn't really land on much, and then noticed some peppermint candy that we had and thought that would be perfect to try and mimic. That I could make a sphere with stripes. And I thought it would be interesting to try and slice through the stripes and twist them and get sort of a twisted stripe, sort of a pattern. I'm not sure what it's called, but there's a technique where you cut rings out of a piece of flat wood and you stack those rings up to form a bowl, and then you turn that. And in doing that, you can twist each one of the rings and get really complicated patterns really quickly by doing that. So the idea I had for this ornament was to make a cylinder and then slice that cylinder into sections, then rotate each section and glue the cylinder back together again. And that would give me the stripy and twisty pattern that I was looking for. So the first thing to do was to make the cylinder, and I'll make those out of a series of long wedges. So I'll cut a 10-degree angle into a bunch of strips of maple and padauk. I think it's padauk. It's red anyways. And I can put all those strips together. And in my first test of putting them together, they didn't quite go together perfectly tight. So I found with doing these rings with a lot of segments, I can sand a few of the segments and get it to fit perfectly. Then I can glue everything. And as there was so much surface area to glue, I did this in quadrants. So I would do 1/4 of it and clamp that quarter together with the other loose strips. Then let that sit for a little bit as the glue set up, and then do the next quadrant and clamp that up and then do the next quadrant. So it took 4 sets of gluing to get it put together. So I then let the glue set up overnight. And I marked one of the strips so that I could see where the alignment was originally once I cut this into sections. Now what I thought I would do is cut this on the bandsaw. So I made a sled that would hold my segmented cylinder as I moved it through the bandsaw blade. So the sled's going to have a platform, or a bottom I guess, and on the side of that there'll be a strip that will run against the edge of the bandsaw table. This bandsaw doesn't have a slot for a track. So if I want to run something parallel to the blade, I have to run it along the edge of the table. Then I needed to make a fence or something that I could hold my cylinder against as I was cutting, and to hold the cylinder perpendicular to the blade. So I can attach all of this with screws. And it looks to be the right size, and I can cut the sections with the sled, and it seemed to be working. I found a nice new blade that I had that was also really thin, so I was losing very little of the wood in the cut. And then the blade broke. I can't remember a time when a blade is broken on this saw. But luckily, I just scratched the top of my finger. And after taking a break for a little while, I went back to see if I had another blade that would cut as well, and I really didn't. I had a couple of similar blades, but they were all dull as they weren't tracking through the wood very well. So what I decided I would do is try and do the same cut and the same sectioning of the cylinder on the table saw. So I made sort of a big stop for the table saw sled, and I could use that to align the cylinder against. I was thinking I was going to clamp the cylinder to that stop that I made with a shim in the cut, but the more I thought about it, that didn't seem like such a good idea. but it did seem to work. I know it's a little tricky because it seems like the slice is going to get caught between the stop and the blade, but it seemed to be okay. And as the cylinder got shorter, I ended up clamping it to the sled. And that way I could keep my hands away from the blade. And that worked pretty well. Doing it on the table saw, I did have to run it through the blade twice to get the full depth. But it seemed to be pretty accurate, and I didn't have much of a seam between the two cuts. So it just took a little bit of sanding. So you can see the pattern I want to make is going to be sort of a twisted cylinder where the ends haven't rotated as much as the middle rotates. My hope is that this pattern will help accentuate the sphere of the ornament. And I just did this pattern by eye, so I would sort of know what part of the cylinder I was gluing and then rotate each piece based on that. With this, I'm starting in the middle and working my way up to the end, so it's rotating less and less at each disc. And I glued this up in 2 halves so that I could hollow out the middle before I glued the 2 halves together. And I can let those dry overnight. So you can see how the whole thing's going to go together. And I can put each half on the lathe and hollow out the inside. So I wanted to make sure the inside wasn't going to be too big. So I measured a circle that would fit within my glue up. And I cut that out of some cardboard and cut the circle in half. And I could use that as a rough guide to see my progress in carving out the hemisphere on each side. Then it was just a matter of carving out the material. Now I was noticing while doing this that at the seams between the different sections, I was getting a lot of tear out or a lot of chip out. But at this point it didn't worry me so much because this was the inside. And when I switched to the scraper, that chip out pretty much went away. And I got a nice clean curve on the inside of the piece. The chips on this project were actually quite beautiful as well, as they were an even mix of maple and padauk. And I cleaned up the rim a little bit so that when I glue the 2 halves together, they'll be centered. And the 2 hemispheres that I carved out of each side will go together as a sphere instead of 2 offset hemispheres. And cleaning up the rim would allow me to hold the piece centered in the jaws of the chuck to drill the hole that'll go on each end. And the hole is basically cleaning up the center of all of the segments. And I'll fill this with a maple plug. And the one little thing I did on the CNC machine was to make the maple plugs for those holes. These plugs could be made on the lathe, but it's a little less trial and error to do it this way. And I can just cut those off. Now I can glue the 2 halves together. And I got the glue on and I started to put it together and it's just like, why won't this go together? And it just didn't feel right. And then I realized I had one of the sides backwards. So I had to clean that up just a little bit and put it together properly. And once I had the alignment about where I wanted it, I could clamp that together. I let that sit just a few minutes, then I could put the plugs in. And you can see what the final complete glue up looks like. And I'll let that all dry overnight. Now I can mount this on the lathe. And I let the plugs stick out a little bit so that I would have something to hold on to on the lathe. And I can start carving this into a sphere. Now, I was noticing on the ends, I was getting some chip out where the different sections are glued together. And in thinking about it, I realized that I'm trying to turn end grain on the ends. And the sections are also end grain glued together. So it wasn't just that it was chip out, but it was also that the glue joint was coming apart on the ends, because I was doing the most difficult cutting by trying to cut end grain, then putting that extra stress on the weakest kind of glue joint, which is gluing end grain to end grain. So in the end, this isn't the best segmented glue up, at least the ends of the sphere, near where the plugs are. So I kept having this chip out problem, and I kept turning the sphere down, sort of chasing those chip outs as the sphere got smaller and smaller and smaller, and not really realizing it was getting so small. And I was getting dangerously close to my void in the center. So I finally just had to stop and just live with the few chips that I had. So it's mostly perfect. Now I used 2 coats of shellac, then 2 coats of wax. Found that gives a nice shiny finish. So after the 2 coats of shellac, I sanded it with 2000 grit sandpaper, then put on 2 coats of wax. So now I'm putting the wax on. And once the wax dries, I can then buff the whole piece. Very carefully buff the whole piece. It's very light. It feels like a blown egg, like it's only the thickness of an eggshell. So it's my first ornament that's actually light enough to go on the tree. So in a way, it's good. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to hang the ornament. I didn't want to do a big wooden cap or any kind of big wooden thing. I've done that in the past, and I've never really liked it. I just wanted to keep it a sphere. I thought about drilling 2 holes and then threading a string through the holes, but I wasn't sure how thick the wall of the sphere was going to be. And if it had any real thickness to it, it would be really difficult to get the string in one hole and then back out the other hole. And that felt a little unfinished, just a string going through 2 holes. So what I ended up doing was finding some little, very simple eye hooks, and I could put one of those in to the sphere and sort of do the minimalist approach. And once I did that, I could thread ribbon through the eye hook and use that to hang the ornament. Sort of.
Merry Christmas!
Thanks for watching.